like to give the floor now to Dr. Arup Banerji, and the floor is yours on social risk management and mitigating social and economic impact from natural disasters.
Thank you very much, Yuka-san, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will try and be quick. I have somebody here trying to make sure that I am in time. So if any of you feel that I am running over time, please also wave, and I will stop talking. But it is a great pleasure and an honor to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for being here despite the rainy weather outside. Not quite a disaster yet in terms of the weather, but it is something that we just learned. Yuka-san, just before this, we went out for a walk, and then the rains came down. And all of us, including Yasu-san, were getting wet. Yuka, who works on disaster risk management, had an umbrella already prepared, and she put it up. And that's, in some ways, I'm joking, but that in some ways is the idea of risk management that I want to talk about today. And this is partly about how social and economic risk management can work together in order to prepare ourselves and be resilient from natural disasters. This is important to set the context. All of you, of course, know that we are now living in what some people have called the new normal. And the new normal is that in a measurable fashion, the number of natural disasters that have been reported have gone up drastically from very few in the beginning of the 20th century, and now in a steadily increasing way up to 2010. And in fact, if you actually look at this downward trend in the graph, that doesn't actually exist if you extend it to 2014, because the number of disasters is going up. So this is really the question of the world we're living in is a much riskier world than we've ever lived in. This is the physical infrastructure we're talking about. This is the physical world where actually a demonstrated fact is that natural disasters are increasing, but there is also a huge human toll to the natural disaster. And again, of course, this country, more than any other, has seen that and experienced that over the last years in terms of the human toll of disasters. And again, as you can see, the number of people now that are affected by disasters every year in the new normal is great. So given that, what we want to underline the fact is that there are very many different risks that we are living in. It is the risk of natural disasters, but there are also risks that we face in the economic and social world. As individuals, many of us, and especially those who are less fortunate than the people represented here, face unemployment, sudden accidents, illness, the loss of incomes due to all sorts of different shocks, as we call it, be it these sorts of shocks or even predictable shocks, such as aging and being unable to work in old age, as well as in many countries, again, less fortunate than ours, the risk that comes from sudden conflicts that really have devastation to people's lives. And then we do have the disaster risks, which come both in sudden onset, or as we call rapid onset disasters, which are things like floods or earthquakes or typhoons or tornadoes or landslides, which happen suddenly without much warning. And there are also things like slow onset disasters, such as droughts, which unfold in slow ways and are sometimes as devastating as the sudden, immediate disasters that might happen. This is the risky world we live in. So how do we manage those risks? To think of a framework for this, I think it's important to just think of the overall goal that we are trying to do, and that is human security. How can we have human beings, families, individuals live in a world that is secure and be able to prosper from that security? And this is, by the way, one of the major aims, as I understand it, of Japan's own development cooperation plan, focused very strongly on human security. Now, within that, there are very many things that we can do in the risk management area to assure human security. First, social risk management. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but social risk management is really to look after the individual. How can individuals or families protect themselves from the sudden risks of the sort that I talked about, and many more? In addition, there is disaster risk management, climate change adaptation, which is really the engineering part of the story. How can we actually build cities, buildings, environments that are strong and resilient to any sort of disasters, especially the sorts of disasters that may affect poor people and poor environments? And finally, and this is important, that there's also an element of financial risk management. And financial risk management is how can we provide the sudden increases that are needed in financial capability when disaster strikes in order for people to cope with disasters. So these are the three elements that we'll talk about today in terms of a framework for addressing risk. So let me talk about, again, to bring sort of the overall concept together in specific examples, what risk management strategies, how they may vary across social risk management and disaster risk management. Many of you here, I know, is familiar with the last column. So I want to use the disaster risk management story to give you the parallels for social risk management. Risk management strategies in general deal with these three types of management. Risk reduction, which means that can we actually lower the probability of that risk from happening? Can we mitigate risk, which is the second, which is try and prepare beforehand to meet the risk when it happens, even if it's of lower probability? And then there is risk coping. Once things happen, how do you cope with the risk? These are the three ways in which any risk management framework thinks about managing the risk. So if you look at first the last column, these are the ways in which you can think of how do you lower the probability of risks having a bad effect. You're not actually lowering the probability of risk, you're probably lowering the probability of the risk having a bad effect on you. It is strengthening infrastructure, reducing greenhouse gases, and so on. That is one of the ways in which disaster risk management operates. How do you prepare in before the risk happens? There are early warning systems, is a beautiful example. You know that a typhoon is going to happen several days before it actually happens. So can we actually prepare for that in advance, ex ante, and therefore make all the preparations needed for that? Or disaster risk financing and insurance, going back to that financial circle that we talked about. How do we actually provide the insurance mechanisms so that if the disaster or the shock happens, we have the finances needed to cope with it? And then there is actually the ex post action. And ex post actions really are the emergency responses. Once the disaster happens, how do you go in and do the rescue and recovery that's needed? Social risk management, which is a field that we work in my global practice at the World Bank, does the parallel sets of things when it comes to individuals and families. And that is in terms of lowering the probability of bad things happening, having sound economic policy and preventative care for against health shocks, for example. In terms of ex ante preparation, the various insurance mechanisms are quite familiar to you, but have parallels to the disaster risk financing insurance. Unemployment insurance, that I'm sure many of you are paying for, against the probability of unemployment. Health insurance against health shocks. Paying in for old age pensions for the shock, the predictable shock of old age, as well as social transfer programs that actually are against the predictable shock of poverty and the deprivations from poverty, welfare programs as they're called. The sad part is that even with these things here, sometimes, especially poor individuals and families, find these not enough, or they're in countries where these mechanisms don't exist. And that leads to risk coping strategies that are pretty dire. It is actually cutting down on foods and basic expenses, taking children out of school, and selling the few assets that poor families have. In Japan, I think you will find these sorts of coping strategies quite unimaginable given the societies that exist here. But in many parts of the world, including my own, I'm from India, these are common among the poor. And this is one of the contexts that we need to be aware of. So let's go back to the framework that we talked about. And of course, we had these three circles. The important part of proper risk management is actually not concentrating on either one of these circles separately. And many countries actually work on either social risk management or disaster risk management or financial risk management. The important part, though, is that intersection of the three. And part of what the conversation we want to start today is about how can countries learn from the experience that Japan has of actually planning in all three areas simultaneously, and how we can bring them together when a disaster happens, so that the physical infrastructure is taken care of, the families and individuals' welfare is taken care of, and there are financial resources available for the recovery that is needed. I want to actually start off with talking and introducing you to the context that I talked about, which is the fact that much of the challenge for the developing world, where much of the population of the world live, in countries in South Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, are where the poor and vulnerable are the most exposed to the adverse consequences of disasters. Because they both have the challenge of living in disaster-prone areas. They don't have access to those formal financial insurance mechanisms, and they often are the last to receive any sort of help. So one of the mechanisms that try to protect them are these social transfer programs that many countries across the developing world have adopted, and they are actually very, very important ways of coping with these. So if you'll indulge me, I will take exactly 6 minutes of your time by me stopping talking and then showing you a short video of two programs in two very different countries, Brazil and Ethiopia, that try and do this to set the context for the conversation that is going to come. So could we actually click on that and talk about and show the movie?
Meu nome é Laila de Jesus da Paixão, tenho 8 anos. Eu acordo de manhã para ir para a escola. Eu vou com minha mãe. Na minha vida, porque eu acho vejo muitas pessoas sendo maltratadas, muitas crianças, muitos adultos, muitas idosas, e também vejo muitos animais, por isso que eu quero ser isso.
Lila lives in Brazil. Her mother has enrolled the family in Bolsa Familia, which is a social safety net program that rewards families for sending their children to school and taking them to the doctor. It is a simple formula. When Lila goes to school regularly, her mother receives a monthly payment. In turn, she can, for example, buy fresh food to provide the family with the necessary nutrition. The payments are made electronically through her Bolsa account, and she can use her Bolsa checking card like any ATM card. In order to receive the payments, families also have to make sure that young children receive proper health care. Immunizations have to be up to date, and their weight has to match their age group. Bolsa workers make sure that families do not fall behind in essential checkups and that the children go to school instead of working to make some extra money for their family.
Tem que tirar eu daqui. Oh, posso ficar assim todo polido, não. Não pode. 6 quilos. Já é meio, 6,5.
In Lila's case, the payments make a big difference. Her mother's only income is babysitting, and Lila often would have to help out to support the family. But because the family gets more money for sending Lila to school than she could earn babysitting, her mother ensures that the 8-year-old does not miss any classes. And Lila, she can be a child, get an education, and really can pursue her dream of becoming a veterinarian.
Eu também queria ficar simples assim, mas como eu vou passar, porque não vou ficar para sempre.
Bolsa Familia helps to close the gap between the rich and poor. Education and health open the window into a different world of new opportunities. But how do safety nets work out for children in other countries? Let's look far away from Brazil. Let's say in Ethiopia. It is a different environment with different challenges, but safety nets play an important role here as well.
سمي يبهل إدمي 13 أيام درجة ناي تمرتي 10 شعنتها 55 تمهرة أحواتي ودات دمه كلتا أقوله دمه كلتا ناي بيسم دمه الشو اللي حلفهم ناي بيسم دمه ولا هايلو ما أنا خفت مصفتي عينها تمرتي فيزيكس كيمستري إنجليش حسابية نساتهم دمه أتكير أنت تصنع دمه دكتور كواني دلي.
Her father can offer his family a loaf of bread every day. That is extraordinary, because in the past, this part of Ethiopia, called Tigray, experienced some of the continent's worst droughts and famines. And not only has the family enough to eat, they've been able to make some modest investments in their little farm. The reason is Ethiopia's safety net program, which has created income through a public works program. For 6 months, Abiba's father is employed and builds these retaining walls. The work is part of a massive water management program that has been years in the making and can be seen all over Ethiopia. In the rainy season, these walls help to retain water long enough so that it can seep into the ground instead of gushing away in a river. And not only do the families receive a steady income for a while, their work has also successfully lifted the groundwater level. Farmers are now able to draw water from wells and ponds. They can plant vegetables and sell the surplus in markets. Additional reforestation programs have made Tigray greener than at any time in the last decades. Tigray is green is the chant of the workers when they leave their shift. The locals here have finally escaped extreme poverty, which haunted the region only a few years ago. They can afford better houses, mosquito nets, even electricity.
قدم حز زنارة مناورة كاوزي دحر عامتات زنارة ناي كازتات عامتنيو بتعامل صبقيو نعمت دا شنتيت نينا دا درني نينا دا دحكا نينا دا حصات نينا كونفوس نينا نصيتنا نشطنا بهزافنا ونصداون مناورنا نمحيشنا.
With the help of safety nets, Abiba and Lila are thriving and making good use of their opportunities. Now you just have to catch the ball when it lands in your court.
So I wanted to just draw the attention to these two cases to talk about a couple of contexts. The contexts are that in some ways these very, very different, two very different programs do two things that are relevant to today's talk. One is that these are both aimed at very poor families who would not have the coping mechanisms that we talked about to manage different types of risks. And the second part is that both of them are simultaneously imparting to the population, to the people who they serve, tools of resilience. Whether in the case of Brazil, which we'll talk about in a second, the case being that the poor families are receiving transfers, but making sure that the children go to school that they otherwise would not have otherwise, without the transfers, without these conditional cash transfers, and therefore having the simultaneous risk mechanisms of both the cash for insurance, self-insurance, and the resilience building education. In the case of Ethiopia, of course, there was also the physical resilience in terms of disaster risk management that they were doing by building these particular water retaining structures and water management structures in addition to the cash that they receive. So very quickly, let me just give you a sense of these two programs, and there are many like this across the developing world. And in fact, countries are building these sorts of programs continuously now in the poorest countries of the world. For Brazil, Bolsa Familia, now 14 million people are receiving transfers. In fact, Brazil has become, from one of the most unequal countries in the world, much, much better in terms of inequality, partly as a result of this program. And there has been, through scientific studies, evidence that this program by itself, with no other factors, have increased hugely the prenatal health care and school attendance and vaccination among children, among the poor. But what happened then in 2011 in Brazil? In 2011 Brazil, there were huge amounts of floods and landslides. So you have the social risk management program, and suddenly there was a disaster, a natural disaster. How did the two programs intersect? Well, what happened is that Bolsa Familia was able to expand its services and provide both in-kind and cash benefits to 162,000 families immediately in the affected areas, just within 10 days. And that was possible because Bolsa Familia, one of the core elements of Bolsa Familia, is a massive registry of families called the Cadastro Único, the unique cadastre, that actually captures vulnerable families in a way that registers who they are, how vulnerable they are, and their names and addresses where they live. Similarly for the Ethiopia program. The safety net program there, which was launched in 2005, you saw provides temporary work. But this had, in the face of natural disaster, even a more dramatic effect. Ethiopia, as you know, and as the film said, is one of the countries most liable to natural disasters, especially drought. And there was such a drought. In 2011, there was the famous drought in the Horn of Africa. And because of this program, the PSNP, or the Productive Safety Nets program, Ethiopia was the only country in the Horn of Africa that was able to protect its population from famine and hunger. And the reason? That, again, this program, which normally just supports the poorest, was able to scale up very quickly from 6.5 million to almost 10 million covered in just 2 months. And these are the sorts of programs that provide the basis for the social risk management interacting with natural disasters. So there is a large body of lessons of how these social risk management instruments are now increasingly being used as core elements of disaster preparedness and disaster risk management. And there are many such examples. In Asia, in East Asia, there is the famous 4P program, or the Pantawid program of conditional cash transfers, which has been one of the major mechanisms of recovery after Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda as it's called, in the Philippines, and has been the major way in which the Philippines government has tried to help the affected populations there. The idea, the basic idea, is shown in this cute diagram, is that you build a very strong social risk management system in poor countries, and then you make sure that disaster risk management methods are actually grafted onto this, piggybacked, as it's called in the slide, piggyback those functions, so that these insurance mechanisms aimed at the poor can be quickly scaled up and paired with the physical infrastructure-oriented programs that these countries have. In practice, what this means is, again, if you think of those 3 circles, think of the core social risk management program, then make sure that there is a financing mechanism built into that that allows that expansion of the program when there's an anticipated risk or a realized risk. And finally, use mechanisms such as poverty maps or disaster risk or risk-prone area maps, hazard maps as they're called, to work and identify where there will be the major risks and how to prepare countries and communities to cope with them. Having said that, let me end the presentation very quickly by thinking about where this conversation should go and how we look forward very much to the interventions by Professor Sawada and Mr. Surumi. And that is that there is a lot of learning to be done, and a lot of learning to be done from Japan's own experience. I have been personally educating myself through the help of my colleagues here about what Japan has been actually doing in this area. And we find that in Japan, there is exactly this mechanism that we are talking about existent right here. That there is livelihood protection, which is very akin to the social risk management program we were talking about. That there is a whole lot of these programs that protect against individual and family risks, whether they be low interest loans for pensioners, the child allowance, the unpaid wage advance for unemployment shocks. And in fact, there is a comprehensive framework that if you click on this, we'll be able to show you, and you can scroll down, that exists, that exactly underlines the sort of mechanisms we're talking about. This is something that we realized, if you look at the titles in the table of contents, these are exactly the sorts of mechanisms we're talking about. And this is something that we found, my colleague Hideki Mori-san found, when we were looking for these examples around the world. And Japan seems to have one of the most sophisticated mechanisms integrating both the social risk management and the disaster risk management and financial risk management parts. So if we go back, let me just go and talk about how this works. And I won't spend any time talking about Japan, but just give you a story that hopefully my colleagues will be able to develop, which is that this is a government structure backed up by local and community structure. In fact, the intersection of these 3 circles is strongest at the community level, from what we understand, and there is a lot to learn. And in fact, this example of Nishinomiya City, which we found out was actually the city Professor Sawada comes from, has a full system of victim support that as the intersection of all three circles that was done as long ago as the response to the earthquake in 1995. So we want to find out more. We would like to hear from you about the experience that you have had in experiencing what the Japanese system is. But the bottom line that we want to understand from the World Bank's perspective, as the introduction pointed out, was that there is this disasters as a new normal that is affecting countries across the world. This is not just East Asia, but is every single country in the world. And to prevent the huge losses in human and physical infrastructure and human lives and livelihoods, we really need to understand how best to cope with all aspects of the issue. And we look forward to learning from you and from Japan how best we can do that, and also hopefully learn from each other's experiences of other countries that have done it well in order to move this agenda forward and onto the front pages of the solutions that we need to have to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity, as Yasu-san mentioned in his opening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arup. So we've learned the importance of combining social risk management with disaster risk management and financial risk management, and how by simultaneously combining these, we can actually help in reducing risk and building resilience of communities.